I mean, honestly, I'm still kind of literally processing the sheer audacity of this guy Richard and his fake Rolex steering wheel cover. It's exactly the kind of petty neighborhood tyranny that made me start sovereign ruling in the first place, I guess. Let's just dive right into it. Ever had a 65-year-old man in pastel golf shorts threaten you with financial ruin over a wooden box? No? Well, pull up a chair, because you are in for a treat. Let me paint a picture for you. I had just moved to Round Rock, Texas. Now, if you have never been to Central Texas in the middle of July, let me explain the ecosystem. It is essentially an oven that someone left on broil, populated entirely by things that want to bite you, sting you, or suck your blood. I bought a house in a neighborhood called The Estates at Pecan Grove. It was one of those aggressively manicured subdivisions where every blade of grass is legally required to be exactly 2.5 inches tall, and all the houses are varying shades of builder-grade beige. I loved the house. I hated the yard. Why? Because my backyard backed up to a beautiful, dense cluster of woods and a slow-moving creek. Sounds idyllic, right? Wrong. That creek was a luxury resort for the most aggressive, steroid-pumped mosquitoes on the North American continent. These things were the size of hummingbirds. You could hear them coming from 3 zip codes away. You couldn't walk out to the patio with a cup of coffee in the morning without instantly donating a pint of O-positive to the local insect mafia. I tried everything. Citronella candles? They laughed at them. Bug zappers? Sounded like a war zone and smelled like burnt hair, but barely made a dent. Toxic chemical sprays? I'd rather not breathe in poison just to eat a hot dog outside. Then, I found the ultimate biological weapon. I was browsing Amazon one night, scratching my ankles raw when I stumbled across a bat box. $40. Unfinished cedar. Looked like a large, flat birdhouse with slats at the bottom instead of a hole in the front. The listing claimed that a healthy colony of bats could eat up to thousands of mosquitoes in a single night. Thousands. I didn't just click Add to Cart. I slammed my finger on Buy It Now with the force of a thunder god. 3 days later, the box arrived. I did my research. You can't just nail a bat box to a fence and call it a day. They need height. They need morning sun. They need a clear drop path so they can swoop out and start their nightly feast. So I went to the local hardware store, bought a 15-foot galvanized steel pole, a bag of quick-setting concrete, and some mounting hardware. I spent my entire Saturday morning digging a hole in the unforgiving, rock-hard Texas clay. I mixed the concrete in a wheelbarrow, set the pole perfectly plumb, and mounted that glorious wooden box right at the top, facing southeast. It was a masterpiece, a beacon of hope against the blood-sucking horde. I was incredibly proud of myself. The bats must have recognized premium real estate when they saw it. It only took about a week and a half before I noticed the signs. Little squeaks at dusk, tiny guano pellets on the grass below. And then, the grand finale. Sitting on my porch at 8:00 p.m., watching a steady stream of little winged acrobats dropping out of the box and vanishing into the twilight to do the Lord's work. Within 2 weeks, the mosquito population in my backyard was decimated. I could finally sit outside in peace. Life was good. And then, the electric whine of a golf cart ruined everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was working from home, typing away at my laptop on the patio, when a customized club car pulled up to my front curb. It was painted a glossy maroon. It had lifted suspension. And sitting behind the wheel was Richard. Richard was the president of the Pecan Grove Homeowners Association. He was the kind of guy who retired at 55 from middle management and immediately decided his new full-time job was making sure nobody in a 2-mile radius experienced a single moment of joy. He was wearing salmon-colored golf shorts, a white polo tucked in so tight I worried for his internal organs, and aviator sunglasses strapped to his head with neon green croquis. I watched him step out of the cart, adjusting his fake Rolex steering wheel cover before grabbing a pristine metal clipboard. He didn't walk. He marched. He didn't even knock on my front door. He just marched right around the side of my house, through my unlocked side gate, and planted his hands on his hips, staring up at my beautiful 15-foot bat sanctuary. "Excuse me," I called out, standing up from my patio chair. "Can I help you?" Richard slowly turned his head. He pulled his aviators down the bridge of his nose. "Are you the homeowner?" "I am, and you are trespassing in my backyard." "I am Richard Vance, HOA president, and I am conducting a compliance inspection." He tapped a pen against his clipboard. "What exactly is that?" He pointed the pen at my pole like it was an unexploded bomb. "That," I said, leaning against the patio railing, "is a bat box." Richard blinked. Once. Twice. "A what?" "A bat box. It houses bats. They eat the mosquitoes. It's incredibly efficient." Richard's face underwent a fascinating color shift, moving from a healthy pink to a deep, dangerous crimson. He started scribbling furiously on his clipboard. "This is an unapproved architectural modification," he snapped, ripping a yellow carbon copy sheet off his pad. "Article 4, Section 12 of the CC&Rs explicitly states that any external structure, outbuilding, or birdhouse must be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee for written approval prior to installation." "It's not an outbuilding, Richard, and it's not a birdhouse. Bats are mammals." "I don't care if it's a condominium for chimpanzees," he yelled, marching over to the patio and aggressively slapping the yellow paper down on my outdoor dining table. "You did not get approval. It is an eyesore. It is a health hazard. And it violates the height restrictions for yard ornaments. You have 48 hours to take it down, or you will be fined $500. I picked up the paper. It was a formal citation. $500 for a piece of cedar on a pole. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and conversational. "I'm not taking it down. The bats have already moved in. It's an active habitat." "Then you will pay the fine," he sneered, adjusting his croquis. "And the fine will double every 30 days until the violation is cured. If you don't remove it, the HOA will hire a contractor to remove it for you, and we will bill you for the labor. Good day." He spun on his heels, marched back to his golf cart, and sped off in a quiet, electric blur. I stood there, holding the yellow slip of paper. $500, threatening to rip my property out of the ground. "You want to play the rules game, Richard?" I thought. "Okay, let's play." I didn't pay the fine. I didn't take down the box. I didn't even respond to the 2 increasingly unhinged certified letters Richard sent me over the next 3 weeks. I just sat on my patio, totally mosquito-free, watching my bats and waiting for his next move. I knew Richard wasn't going to let it go. Men like Richard never do. Their entire identity is wrapped up in their perceived authority. If he let one homeowner defy him, the whole house of cards would come tumbling down. 30 days came and went. The fine automatically doubled to $1,000. And then, the HOA made their fatal mistake. It was a beautiful Thursday morning. I was in my kitchen making a fresh pot of coffee when I heard the unmistakable, bone-rattling rumble of heavy diesel machinery. I looked out my kitchen window, backing up over my front curb, crushing a row of my carefully planted petunias in the process, was a bright orange Bobcat skid steer loader. Attached to the side of the cab was a magnetic sign that read, "Big Mike's Landscaping and Removal." I grabbed my coffee mug. I smiled. Showtime. I walked out my front door just as the Bobcat was maneuvering toward my side gate. Walking next to the machine was a guy who could only be Big Mike. He was about 6'4", built like a brick wall, wearing a sweat-stained trucker hat and a high-vis yellow vest. He had a clipboard in his hand, probably a work order signed by a certain HOA president. "Morning," I yelled over the roar of the diesel engine. Big Mike signaled the driver to kill the engine. The Bobcat idled down to a low rumble, and Mike walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his massive hand. "You the homeowner?" Mike asked. His voice sounded like gravel in a blender. "I am. Can I ask what you're doing driving heavy machinery onto my property?" Mike looked at his clipboard. "Got a work order from the HOA. Property management authorized an involuntary removal of an unapproved structure in the backyard. Just here to pull a pole out of the ground, buddy. Nothing personal. I'm just doing the job I was hired for." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Right. The pole in the backyard. Did Richard happen to mention what was on that pole?" Mike frowned, looking down at the paper. "Says here, an unauthorized wooden box." "It's a bat roost, Mike?" Mike stared at me. "A what?" "A bat roost. Specifically, a maternity roost for a colony of Mexican free-tailed bats." I stepped off the porch and walked a little closer to him. "Tell me something, Mike. Do you have a federal permit?" Mike took a step back, visibly confused. "Permit for what? I pull out stumps and rip up fences. I don't need a permit to pull a pole." I shook my head, adopting a look of deep, empathetic concern. "Mike, I am trying to save you from a very, very bad day. Under the Texas Parks and Wildlife Code, and backed up by the Federal Endangered Species Act, depending on the exact composition of that colony, it is a massive criminal offense to disturb, relocate, or destroy an active bat roost without proper authorization." I took another sip of coffee. The silence was thick. "If you or your guy in that Bobcat touch that pole," I continued, keeping my voice light and conversational, "you are committing a wildlife crime. The fines start at $10,000 per incident. Not for the HOA, Mike. For you, because you're the one operating the equipment. Plus, they can confiscate your machinery. I'm assuming that Bobcat wasn't cheap?" Mike looked at the orange skid steer. He looked at me. He looked back at his clipboard. "Are you messing with me, man?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "I am completely serious," I said. "Go walk in the backyard and look at it. You'll see the guano. You'll hear them if you put your ear to the pole. It's an active habitat. Now, I don't know what Richard is paying you for this job, but I highly doubt it covers federal defense attorneys and the seizure of your business assets." Big Mike was a smart guy. You don't run a successful landscaping business by being an idiot. He immediately realized he was being used as a pawn in a suburban turf war. He pulled a cell phone out of his pocket. "Hold on." He dialed a number, waited a few seconds, and then hit the speakerphone button. "Richard Vance," a voice crackled through the speaker. It was our favorite pastel-wearing tyrant. "Yeah, Richard, it's Mike. I'm over at the property on Elm Creek Drive." "Ah, excellent." Richard sounded giddy. "Is the eyesore removed? Have you billed the property account?" "No, Richard, it ain't removed," Mike growled. "Why didn't you tell me this was a live bat colony?" There was a pause on the line. "It's an unapproved birdhouse. It doesn't matter what's in it. The CC&Rs clearly state—" "I don't give a damn about your CC&Rs, Richard," Mike bellowed, his face turning red. "This guy is standing here telling me it's a federal crime to knock this thing down. You want me to get my equipment seized over your neighborhood drama?" "That is ridiculous," Richard squawked. "He's lying. Pull it down immediately. You are under contract." "My contract says I do legal removals. I ain't touching federal wildlife, you absolute clown," Mike yelled. "I'm packing up, and I'm charging the HOA a $200 cancellation fee for wasting my morning and making me drive out here. If you don't pay it, I'm putting a lien on the clubhouse." "You can't do that. I demand you—" Mike hit the end call button with his thumb, cutting Richard off mid-tantrum. He looked at me, breathing heavily. He gestured to the crushed petunias by the curb. "Sorry about your flowers, man." Don't worry about it, Mike. Have a good one. Yeah, you too. Mike signaled his driver. The bobcat reversed off my lawn, leaving heavy tread marks in the grass, and rolled up onto the flatbed trailer parked down the street. Within 5 minutes, Big Mike's landscaping and removal was gone, leaving nothing but the sweet, sweet smell of diesel exhaust and absolute victory. I went back inside and poured a second cup of coffee. I knew this wasn't the end. Richard was humiliated. He was out $200 for the cancellation fee, and the box was still standing. He was going to escalate, and I was going to be ready. Honestly, I kind of figured it would take Richard at least a day to regroup after the whole Big Mike fiasco, but I clearly underestimated the man's sheer, unadulterated, petty rage. It was maybe 2 hours later. The Texas sun was literally baking the pavement, pushing the temperature into that miserable high 90s territory where the air just feels heavy and oppressive. I was sitting in my living room, AC blasting, keeping an eye out the front window because, I knew the universe wasn't going to just let me win that easily. And right on cue, a white Ford Explorer with the local police department's blue and silver decals rolled slowly down my street. And then, a second one right behind it. No sirens, but the light bars were flashing, casting these harsh red and blue reflections against the boring beige siding of all the neighborhood houses. They parked right in front of my driveway, blocking me in. Now, I'm not going to lie, seeing 2 cop cars pull up to your house is inherently stressful, no matter how much you know you're in the right. But I had spent the last 2 hours prepping for exactly this. I grabbed my Yeti cup, which was full of ice water, and a thick, dark blue 3-ring binder I had frantically assembled after Mike left. I walked out the front door just as 2 officers were stepping out of their vehicles. They looked exactly like you'd expect Central Texas cops in July to look. Sweaty, annoyed, and completely over whatever nonsense they had been dispatched to deal with. They both had their hands resting casually near the center of their duty belts, scanning the yard like they expected a hostage situation. "Afternoon, officers," I called out, staying on my porch, keeping my hands visible, one holding the cup, the other holding the binder. The older cop, a guy with salt and pepper hair and a nameplate that read Miller, gave me a tight nod. "You the homeowner?" "Yes, sir. I assume you're here about the bat box?" Miller exchanged a look with his partner, a younger, stockier guy named Davis. Davis looked confused. "We got a call from a Mr. Richard Vance," Officer Miller said, walking up the driveway. He stated there was a hostile resident harassing local contractors, creating a severe public health hazard, and refusing to comply with neighborhood safety ordinances. He made it sound like you were out here waving a weapon at a landscaping crew. I literally laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. I assure you, gentlemen, the only thing I waved at the landscaping crew was a cup of coffee. The contractor left voluntarily when he found out what Richard was actually asking him to do. Before Miller could ask a follow-up question, the high-pitched whine of an electric motor cut through the air. Richard's maroon golf cart came careening around the corner at its absolute top speed of maybe 14 miles an hour. He slammed on the brakes, skidding slightly on the asphalt, and practically vaulted out of the driver's seat. "Officers! Officers! Thank God you're here!" Richard shouted, power walking toward us. His face was a magnificent shade of plum. "I am Richard Vance, HOA president. This is the man. He is violating multiple community guidelines. He chased away our contracted workers with threats, and he is harboring a swarm of disease-carrying vermin on his property." Officer Davis held up a hand. "Okay, Mr. Vance. Let's take it down a notch. We're just trying to figure out what's going on." "What's going on is that he is breaking the law." Richard pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. "I want him cited for disturbing the peace, and I want that monstrosity in his backyard torn down immediately by order of the police department." Miller sighed, a deep, heavy sound that communicated years of dealing with suburban disputes. He looked at me. "Do you have some kind of unauthorized structure in your backyard, sir?" "I have a bat roost," I said calmly. It's a wooden box on a pole. It houses Mexican free-tailed bats. They eat the mosquitoes. It's totally harmless. It is a biohazard, Richard shrieked. Rabies, guano. It's a threat to every child in this neighborhood. Honestly, Richard, the only threat to the children in this neighborhood is your driving in that golf cart, I shot back, taking a sip of my ice water. Okay, enough, Miller said sternly. He looked at me. Sir, if it's violating HOA rules, you need to take it down. We don't enforce HOA bylaws, but if it's causing a major disturbance, we might have to get code enforcement involved. I totally understand that, Officer Miller, I said, setting my Yeti cup down on the porch railing. I opened my blue binder. But the problem is, I literally can't take it down, and neither can Richard. And, with all due respect, neither can you. Both cops frowned. Richard let out a loud, theatrical scoff. Listen to him. He thinks he's above the law. No, I think I'm bound by federal and state law, I said. I pulled a highlighted printout from the binder and handed it down to Officer Miller. That is a direct printout of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Code, Chapter 64, regarding the protection of non-game wildlife, specifically bats. Once bats establish a maternity roost, which they have in that box, it is considered an active habitat. It is illegal to hunt, sell, purchase, or possess them, and it is explicitly illegal to disturb or destroy their roosting site. Miller looked down at the paper. He read it in silence for a few seconds. I pulled out a second sheet and handed it to Officer Davis. And that one is a summary of the Federal Endangered Species Act, along with EPA guidelines on protected native habitats. While Mexican free-tailed bats aren't federally endangered, they are highly protected as a keystone species for agricultural pest control. Furthermore, if there happens to be even a single tricolored bat in that box, which are currently under review for endangered status, touching that pole becomes a federal felony. The younger cop, Davis, looked from the paper to me, his eyes wide. Wait, so like a literal federal crime? Fines start at $10,000 and can carry jail time, I said smoothly. That is exactly what I told Big Mike, the landscaper Richard hired. Once I informed Mike that he would be personally liable for a wildlife crime and could have his bobcat seized by the federal government, he very wisely decided to cancel the job and leave. Miller slowly handed the paper back to me. He looked at Richard, and his expression had shifted from annoyed to deeply unamused. Mr. Vance, Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, did you call us out here to try and force this man to commit a state wildlife violation? It's a birdhouse, Richard yelled, his voice cracking. He bought it on Amazon. You can't just buy a box, stick it on a pole, and claim federal immunity from the HOA. Well, I mean, actually, you kind of can, I interjected. The bats don't care where the box came from. Once they move in, it's theirs. The law protects the animals, not the architecture. This is absurd, Richard stomped his foot. He literally stomped his foot like a toddler. I demand you arrest him for something. Creating a nuisance. Officer Miller shook his head, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. Mr. Vance, this is entirely a civil matter, and from the looks of it, it's a state wildlife matter. The Round Rock Police Department is not going to touch that pole. We are not going to order him to touch that pole, and if you or anyone you hire touches that pole, and this gentleman reports you to the game warden, you are going to be in a world of trouble. But the CCNRs, Richard pleaded, desperate now. The neighborhood guidelines. Your HOA guidelines do not supersede state and federal wildlife protections, Richard, I said, closing the binder with a satisfying snap. I highly recommend we all just slowly back away from the pole and let the bats do their jobs. Davis snorted, trying and failing to hide a smile. We're done here, Miller said definitively. Mr. Vance, Do not call the emergency dispatch line for HOA disputes again, or I will cite you for misuse of the 911 system. Have a good afternoon." The two officers turned their backs on a sputtering, hyperventilating Richard, got into their cruisers, and drove away. Richard stood in my driveway for a full minute, staring at the spot where the police cars had been. He looked completely broken. His ultimate trump card, the police, had just folded in spectacular fashion. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes was almost beautiful. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice shaking. "I will find a way to bankrupt you. I will lien your house. I will foreclose on you. You will lose everything over this." "Have a great day, Richard," I called out cheerfully, picking up my ice water and heading back inside. I locked the door, leaned against it, and let out a massive breath. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins. I had won the battle, but Richard's threat wasn't entirely empty. HOAs have terrifying amounts of power in Texas. They really can put liens on your house for unpaid fines. They really can foreclose on you if they stack enough legal fees against you. If I was going to survive this, I couldn't just play defense. I needed to go on the offensive. I needed to find a way to make Richard and the HOA board regret ever looking in my direction. I went to my home office, fired up my desktop computer, and cracked my knuckles. It was time to go down the rabbit hole. I spent the next 6 hours doing nothing but reading legal statutes, environmental case law, and municipal zoning codes. I was looking for a weapon. I drank 3 cups of coffee and ate half a bag of stale tortilla chips while I scoured the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, guidelines. And then, right around 8 p.m., just as the bats were starting to drop out of their box for the evening, I found it. It was a tiny, easily overlooked subsection in the state environmental planning guidelines regarding protected habitats. It stated that when a documented significant colony of protected wildlife is officially registered with the state, a buffer zone of active foraging habitat is established around it. Any major commercial development or significant land clearing operations within that radius require a mandatory environmental impact assessment to ensure the new construction won't disrupt the colony's ecosystem or food supply. I stared at the screen. My heart started beating faster. I minimized the legal PDF and pulled up the neighborhood's master plan on the HOA's community portal. For the last 3 weeks, there had been massive dump trucks and excavators rumbling down the street behind my house. The HOA was sitting on a massive reserve fund, and Richard had pushed through a vanity project, the Pecan Grove luxury tennis and pool pavilion. They were currently in the process of clearing 3 entire acres of dense woods directly behind my property line to build a massive clubhouse, 4 tennis courts, and an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The budget was supposedly somewhere around $2.5 million. They had already knocked down dozens of trees and were currently grading the dirt. I pulled up Google Earth. I used the measuring tool. The distance from my 15-foot bat pole to the edge of the HOA's active construction zone was exactly 185 yards, well within the typical buffer zone for a registered wildlife habitat. I literally started laughing out loud in my empty office. It was too perfect. It was a silver bullet. If I could get my bat box officially registered and recognized by the state as a significant wildlife habitat, the HOA's multi-million-dollar vanity project, Richard's crown jewel, would be operating illegally in a protected foraging zone. But I couldn't just call the state and say, "Hey, I have some bats. Please stop the bulldozers." Bureaucracy requires paperwork. It requires experts. The next morning, I started making phone calls. I contacted the biology department at a major university up in Austin and asked if they had anyone who specialized in chiropterology, the study of bats. They transferred me to a local wildlife rescue and research group, and eventually I got a guy named Dr. Eris Thorne on the phone. I explained the situation. I told him I had set up a maternity box, the bats had moved in, and I wanted to officially document and register the colony for conservation purposes. I left out the part about the HOA war, because I didn't want him thinking this was just a spite project. Dr. Thorne was thrilled. "That's fantastic," he said, his voice brimming with nerdy enthusiasm. "Urban roosts are so vital right now with habitat loss. I'd love to come out, do a species count, and get you into the state database. I can be there tomorrow evening right before emergence." "That would be incredible, Dr. Thorne," I said. "And just to confirm, once you file the paperwork, it becomes a documented state habitat, correct?" "Absolutely," he said. "It goes into the Texas Natural Diversity Database. It helps with tracking populations and ensuring local developments are aware of environmental sensitivities." Environmental sensitivities. Music to my ears. Dr. Thorne showed up the next evening in a battered Subaru Outback covered in bumper stickers about saving various ugly animals. He was a tall, incredibly skinny guy wearing cargo shorts and a headlamp. He brought an ultrasonic bat detector, a clipboard, and a camera with a massive lens. We stood in my backyard as the sun started to set. He pointed the detector at the box, and it immediately started clicking and whirring, picking up the high-frequency echolocation calls of the bats inside waking up. "Oh yeah, that's a healthy colony," Dr. Thorne whispered, adjusting his glasses. "You've got a lot of activity in there." We waited for about 20 minutes, and then the show began. The bats started dropping out of the bottom of the box, opening their wings, and swooping up into the darkening sky. Dr. Thorne was snapping pictures furiously, muttering to himself. "Mexican freetail, definitely. Look at the wing shape. Oh, hold on." He adjusted his headlamp and looked at the digital screen on his camera. He zoomed in on one of the blurry shapes. "Well, look at that," he said, grinning from ear to ear. "You don't just have free-tailed bats in there. I'm pretty sure I just spotted an evening bat, and possibly a cave myotis mixing in. That is excellent biodiversity for a residential box." "Does that make the habitat more significant?" I asked, trying to keep the eager edge out of my voice. "Oh, absolutely," he said, scribbling on his clipboard. "A multi-species maternity roost is a prime conservation asset. I'm going to fast-track this registration. You should be officially in the state database by Monday morning." "Dr. Thorne, you are an absolute legend," I said. Before he left, I had him sign a printed affidavit stating he had personally verified the colony, documented the species, and was submitting the site to the Texas Natural Diversity Database. Monday morning rolled around. I checked my email. Sure enough, Dr. Thorne had copied me on the official submission to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. My backyard was now officially on the map. It was time to spring the trap. I didn't call Richard. I didn't call the HOA. I bypassed them completely and went straight to the heavy hitters. I drafted a meticulously worded email attaching Dr. Thorne's affidavit, the state database confirmation, photos of the roost, and a satellite map showing the distance from the roost to the HOA construction site. I sent the email to 3 different places: the regional office of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, TPWD, the local field office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Municipal Code Enforcement Office for the city of Round Rock. The subject line of the email was simple, but terrifying if you knew what it meant. Urgent. Active, unpermitted heavy construction within foraging buffer of documented multi-species Chiroptera maternity habitat. In the body of the email, I politely informed the agencies that a massive 3-acre land clearing operation was currently underway, less than 200 yards from a newly registered multi-species bat roost. I noted that no environmental impact assessment had been filed or posted by the developer, the HOA, and that the heavy dust, noise, and destruction of foraging trees posed an immediate critical threat to the colony's survival. I formally requested an emergency halt to construction until a proper environmental survey could be conducted. I hit send at 9 a.m. Honestly, I thought it would take a few weeks for the government wheels to turn. I figured I'd be fighting this battle over a long, drawn-out summer. But I had underestimated one crucial thing. State and federal wildlife agencies do not play around when it comes to undocumented construction near protected habitats. It is one of the few things that cuts through bureaucratic red tape like a hot knife through butter. I didn't have to wait weeks. I didn't even have to wait days. The reckoning arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 24 hours later. Tuesday morning dawned bright, clear, and already uncomfortably warm. I woke up to the sound of heavy diesel engines firing up in the woods behind my house. It was 8 a.m., and the clearing crew was getting an early start. I made myself a massive tumbler of iced tea, grabbed a pair of binoculars, and walked out to my back fence. Through the slats of the wooden fence, I had a perfect, elevated view of the construction site. It looked like a war zone. Dozens of beautiful, century-old pecan and oak trees had already been reduced to splintered stumps. Massive yellow excavators were pushing piles of topsoil into jagged mountains. But today wasn't just a regular workday. Today was a media event. Over by the temporary chain-link construction gate, a white pop-up tent had been erected. Underneath it was a folding table covered in a white tablecloth, holding a spread of pastries and mimosas in plastic flutes. Standing around the table was the entire Pecan Grove HOA board of directors. And right in the center, glowing with absolute self-importance, was Richard. He was wearing a brand-new, crisply ironed pastel blue polo shirt and khaki slacks. He was holding an absurdly shiny, gold-painted shovel with a big red ribbon tied around the handle. Beside him was a skinny kid with a DSLR camera, probably a photographer for some hyper-local community newsletter nobody actually read. Richard was posing, pointing the golden shovel toward the dirt, smiling like he had just cured a major disease. It was the official groundbreaking ceremony for the luxury tennis and pool pavilion, the pinnacle of his tenure as HOA president. I leaned against my fence, sipping my iced tea, just watching the theater of it all. I knew what was coming. I just didn't know exactly when. At 8:45 a.m., the photographer was snapping photos of Richard shaking hands with the site foreman. At 8:47 a.m., a cloud of dust appeared at the far end of the temporary dirt access road. Two vehicles were driving far too fast for a construction zone. They were both heavy-duty, white Ford F-250 pickup trucks. As they got closer, the morning sun caught the emblems on their doors. The lead truck had the dark green, circular seal of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The trailing truck bore the badge of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. I literally felt my heart do a little happy dance in my chest. Oh, this is going to be magnificent. The two trucks didn't park politely outside the gate. They drove straight onto the graded dirt, right past a "No Unauthorized Vehicles" sign, and threw themselves into park mere yards away from the mimosa table. 4 people stepped out of the trucks. They were not wearing pastel polos. They were wearing heavy canvas tactical pants, sturdy boots, and dark green polo shirts with embroidered badges. 2 of them had heavy utility belts equipped with radios and sidearms. The site foreman, a burly guy in a hard hat, immediately started walking toward them, waving his arms. "Hey, you can't park here. We got heavy equipment moving." The lead agent, a tall, serious-looking woman with her hair pulled back into a tight bun, didn't even slow her stride. She reached into her shirt pocket, pulled out a leather badge wallet, and flipped it open in the foreman's face. "Federal Agent Davis, U.S. Fish and Wildlife," she said, her voice easily carrying over the rumble of the excavators. "Power down the machines. Now." The foreman stopped dead in his tracks. "Excuse me." I said power down the heavy machinery, sir, Agent Davis repeated, her tone completely flat and devoid of humor. This site is currently under a federal stop work directive. If those buckets move another inch of dirt, I will start impounding equipment. The foreman didn't argue. He immediately grabbed the two-way radio clipped to his vest. All units, shut 'em down. Cut the engines. Now, drop the buckets and kill the power. Within 30 seconds, the deafening roar of the construction site spooled down into absolute, eerie silence. Over by the pop-up tent, Richard had dropped his golden shovel. He was staring at the agents, his mouth opening and closing like a landed bass. He finally snapped out of his shock and marched over, adjusting his aviator sunglasses. "Excuse me, what is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, adopting his best, "I want to speak to the manager" tone. "I am Richard Vance, the president of this homeowners association. You are disrupting a private event on private property. Who authorized you to halt our contractors?" Agent Davis turned to look at Richard. She looked him up and down, taking in the pastel polo and the mimosas. "Are you the authorized representative for the entity funding this land-clearing operation?" she asked. "I am the president," Richard barked. "And I demand you remove yourselves from this site immediately so we can resume our groundbreaking." The second agent, a guy from the State Department with a thick mustache and a clipboard, stepped forward. "Mr. Vance, I'm Warden Miller with Texas Parks and Wildlife. We received a verified report, backed by a sworn affidavit from a credentialed state biologist, that you are currently executing unpermitted heavy earth-moving operations within the active foraging buffer zone of a registered multi-species bat maternity roost." Richard blinked. He looked at the federal agent, then at the state warden. "A what?" "A Chiroptera maternity habitat," Agent Davis said. "Bats, Mr. Vance. Specifically, a colony containing species that are currently flagged for environmental protection. Your construction site is exactly 185 yards from the registered roost." I could see the exact moment the gears in Richard's brain locked up. He physically recoiled, taking a step back, the color draining from his face. He slowly turned his head, looking past the dirt, past the tree line, directly toward my backyard fence. I raised my tumbler of iced tea and gave him a cheerful, highly exaggerated wave. "No," Richard gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Then, his face flooded with color, turning violently purple. "No, that is a birdhouse. It's a wooden box he bought on Amazon. He's lying to you. It's an illegal yard ornament." "Sir, the origin of the box is legally irrelevant," Warden Miller said smoothly, looking at his clipboard. "The state has visually confirmed the colony. It is in the database, and as of 9 a.m. this morning, this entire 3-acre parcel is flagged as a sensitive environmental zone." "It is a box on a stick," Richard screamed, completely losing whatever shred of dignity he had left. He pointed wildly in my direction. "Arrest him! He did this on purpose. He put that box there to spite me because I fined him $500. Agent Davis took a step closer to Richard, completely invading his personal space. "Mr. Vance, I highly recommend you lower your voice. The motive of the homeowner is not my jurisdiction. My jurisdiction is the Federal Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. And right now, you are in violation of both." Richard's mouth snapped shut. Agent Davis reached into the folder she was carrying and pulled out a stack of documents stapled to a bright red piece of heavy cardstock. "This is an official stop work order," she announced, her voice echoing across the silent dirt lot. "As of this exact moment, all land clearing, grading, pouring, and construction operations on this parcel are frozen, indefinitely." The site foreman let out a heavy groan and rubbed his temples. "Frozen?" Richard choked out. "For how long? We have contractors. We have timelines. We're pouring the tennis court foundation next week." "You are not pouring anything, Mr. Vance," Warden Miller said, handing the red cardstock to the foreman, who immediately began zip-tying it to the chain-link fence. Before you can move another grain of dirt on this site, the HOA is legally required to conduct a comprehensive Phase 1 and Phase 2 environmental impact assessment. An assessment? Richard asked, his voice trembling. What does that entail? You will need to hire an independent, state-certified environmental engineering firm, Miller explained, casually ticking the items off on his fingers. They will conduct a multi-season wildlife survey, a soil stability test, and an acoustic foraging study to ensure your construction noise and lights will not disrupt the colony. Once they compile their findings, they will submit a remediation plan to my office and to the federal office for review. How long does that take? Richard asked. He looked like he was about to physically vomit. Standard timeline for an acoustic foraging study is 6 to 12 months, Agent Davis said flatly. Depending on the backlog at the review board, maybe longer. A year? Richard shrieked. We can't freeze this project for a year. The interest on the development loan alone will bankrupt the reserve fund. How much does this assessment cost? Agent Davis shrugged slightly. It varies. For a 3-acre commercial-grade development, you're probably looking at between $40,000 and $60,000, payable to the engineering firm. That does not include any legal fees you might incur if you attempt to fight this directive in federal court, which I assure you, you will lose. I had to put my iced tea down on the fence rail because my hands were shaking with pure, unadulterated joy. $60,000. A year-long delay, all because he couldn't just let a man keep a $40 wooden box in his backyard to eat some mosquitoes. This is a mistake, Richard panicked, looking desperately at the other HOA board members who were suddenly backing away from him like he was highly radioactive. We have permits from the city. The city approved this. The city does not override federal wildlife protections, Mr. Vance, Davis said, her tone indicating that the conversation was now over. If I drive by this site tomorrow and see a shovel in the dirt, I will return with U.S. Marshals, and I will start freezing the HOA's bank accounts. Do we have a clear understanding? Richard didn't answer. He just stared at the red stop work order flapping gently in the morning breeze. He looked incredibly small and incredibly old. The site foreman walked over to Richard. Hey, Rich, we got a problem. Richard looked at him blankly. What? My crew is on the clock. My machines are on site. My contract says I get paid for delays outside of my control. The foreman crossed his massive arms. If we're locked out for a year, I'm pulling my gear today, and I'm billing the HOA for breach of contract, early termination fees, and idle equipment costs. Expect an invoice by Friday. It's going to be a big one. The foreman turned around and whistled sharply. Pack it up, boys! Load the excavators! We're done here! The federal and state agents didn't linger. They had delivered their payload. They got back into their white trucks, backed up, and drove away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the total, absolute annihilation of Richard's legacy. I picked up my iced tea, took a long, satisfying sip, and walked back inside to enjoy the air conditioning. The fallout was spectacular. And I do mean spectacular. You see, HOAs operate on a very delicate balance of apathy. Most people don't care what the HOA board does, as long as the neighborhood looks nice and the monthly dues stay low. But the absolute second you mess with a homeowner's wallet, that apathy turns into a raging inferno. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By Wednesday afternoon, everyone knew that the massive tennis pavilion project had been federally shut down. By Thursday morning, rumors were flying that the contractor was suing the HOA for breach of contract, and on Friday, the official letter went out. The HOA board, clearly in full panic mode, sent a certified letter to every resident in Pecan Grove. It announced an emergency, mandatory town hall meeting to discuss a critical budget shortfall and a temporary special assessment fee to cover unforeseen environmental engineering costs. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday night at the local middle school gymnasium. I arrived 10 minutes early, and it was already standing room only. Honestly, It looked less like an HOA meeting and more like a peasant uprising in medieval Europe. People were furious. I took a seat in the back row, blending into the crowd, wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. At the front of the gym, sitting behind a folding table, were the 5 members of the HOA board. Richard was in the center, flanked by the treasurer and the secretary. Richard looked awful. He had dark circles under his eyes. His hair was unkempt, and he wasn't wearing his signature pastel polo. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. The meeting started, and it immediately devolved into total chaos. The treasurer, a nervous-looking accountant type, took the microphone. He tried to explain the math. The contractor was demanding a $25,000 kill fee. The environmental engineering firm required a $20,000 retainer just to start the year-long assessment. And the HOA's legal counsel had already billed them $5,000 just to read the federal stop work order. In order to maintain our legal reserve requirements, the treasurer stammered over the screeching feedback of the cheap PA system, we have no choice but to levy an emergency special assessment of $600 per household, payable within 30 days, and we will be raising the monthly dues by 20% for the next 2 fiscal years. The gymnasium exploded. People were screaming. A woman in the second row threw a plastic water bottle at the table. A guy in a Dallas Cowboys jersey stood on his folding chair and started demanding an audit. Richard grabbed the microphone, his hands shaking. "Please, order. Please, listen to me," he begged, his voice echoing shrilly in the cavernous room. "This is not our fault. We were sabotaged." The crowd quieted down just a fraction, sensing drama. "We were legally building the pavilion." Richard pointed a trembling finger out into the crowd, scanning the faces until he found me sitting quietly in the back row. "Him. It's his fault. He erected an illegal bat box. He brought the federal government down on us out of pure spite because I was enforcing the rules. If he hadn't put up that box, none of this would have happened." Every head in the gymnasium turned to look at me. 400 angry suburbanites staring daggers. I didn't panic. I just stood up slowly. I didn't have a microphone, but I have a voice that carries when I need it to. "Richard," I said clearly, my voice bouncing off the cinder block walls. "Did you or did you not personally issue me a $500 fine for a $40 piece of wood?" Richard scowled. "It was an unapproved architectural modification." "And," I continued, pacing slowly down the center aisle, holding the attention of the entire room. "When I refused to pay that absurd fine, did you, or did you not, try to hire heavy machinery to trespass on my property and destroy a federally protected wildlife habitat, putting the contractor at risk of federal prison?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. People were looking at each other, eyebrows raised. "Rules are rules!" Richard shrieked into the mic. "And laws are laws, Richard," I fired back, raising my voice to easily overpower his panicked squeaking. "I begged you to leave it alone. I showed the police the state statutes. The police told you to walk away. Big Mike told you to walk away, but your ego couldn't handle a wooden box in a backyard. So you pushed." "And you pushed." I stopped halfway down the aisle and turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, my bat box didn't cost this neighborhood a dime. It eats mosquitoes. It minds its own business. The reason you're all being asked to pay $600 today is because Richard Vance decided his personal vendetta was more important than doing basic environmental due diligence on a $2.5 million construction project. He built a clubhouse next to a creek without checking the wildlife registry. That is negligence. And now he wants you to pay for his incompetence." The silence in the gymnasium was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. And then The guy in the Cowboys jersey stood up again. I move for a vote of no confidence to immediately remove Richard Vance from the board of directors. I second, yelled a woman holding a sleeping toddler. All in favor? The Cowboys guy roared. Every single hand in the room shot into the air. It was unanimous. It was brutal. It was the most beautiful display of suburban democracy I had ever witnessed. Richard didn't say a word. He just slowly put the microphone down on the folding table, stood up, and walked out the side door of the gymnasium. He didn't look back. The rest of the board immediately caved. The treasurer took the mic back and desperately promised to suspend the special assessment while they looked for alternative solutions. After the meeting, the newly appointed interim HOA president, a very tired-looking woman named Brenda who just wanted to grow her tomatoes in peace, cornered me near the exit. Look, Brenda said, rubbing her temples, we are in a massive bind. We can't afford the environmental study. We can't afford to fight the federal government. If we cancel the pavilion project completely, the contractor gets to keep the massive deposit we already paid them, and we're left with a giant dirt pit in the woods. What do we do? I smiled. I actually felt a little bad for Brenda. She was just collateral damage in Richard's war. Brenda, I'll make you a deal, I said. I happen to have a very good working relationship with Dr. Thorne, the state biologist who certified the roost, and I've done a lot of reading on the EPA guidelines for habitat mitigation. Brenda looked at me like I was throwing her a life preserver in a hurricane. What do you want? First, I said, the HOA officially drops all fines against my property and formally approves my bat box in writing. Done, Brenda said instantly. I'll sign it tonight. What else? Second, the HOA adopts a wildlife-friendly community charter. No more mandatory toxic chemical sprays. No more harassing homeowners who want to put up birdhouses, bat boxes, or native pollinator gardens. We stop fighting nature and start working with it. Brenda nodded furiously. I completely agree. It'll save us money on landscaping anyway. Is that it? Third, I said softly, leaning in a bit, I will help you draft a mitigation proposal to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. If the HOA agrees to redesign the tennis pavilion, scaling it back, moving the footprint 50 yards further away from the tree line, installing bat-friendly acoustic barriers, and using low-lumen, downward-facing lights, we can likely get the state to grant an exemption to the year-long study. We can downgrade it to a rapid assessment. It'll cost the HOA maybe $5,000 instead of $50,000, and you can resume construction in a month. Brenda stared at me, genuinely impressed. You already thought of the solution before you even dropped the hammer on Richard, didn't you? Classic sovereign ruling move, Brenda, I smiled. I never start a legal fire unless I know exactly how to put it out. True to my word, I spent the next 2 weeks working with Brenda and Dr. Thorne. We drafted a beautiful, comprehensive habitat mitigation plan. The HOA board formally voted to adopt the wildlife-friendly charter, completely rewriting Richard's draconian CCNRs. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reviewed our mitigation plan, commended the neighborhood on its proactive conservation efforts, and lifted the stop work order. The pavilion project was scaled down, saving the HOA enough money to completely cover the contractor delays without raising anyone's dues. Richard sold his house 3 months later. I watched the moving trucks load up his stuff from my front porch. I didn't wave this time, but I did raise my coffee mug in a silent toast as his maroon golf cart was loaded onto a flatbed trailer. Life in Round Rock went back to normal. Well, a better version of normal. It's been a year since the Great Bat War. I'm sitting on my patio right now. It's a gorgeous Tuesday evening. The sun is just starting to dip below the tree line, painting the Texas sky in vibrant shades of purple and orange. Down the street, I can faintly hear the satisfying thwack of a tennis ball from the newly completed, sensibly lit, acoustically shielded community courts. But out here in my backyard, it's peaceful. The air is cool. I'm not wearing bug spray. There isn't a citronella candle in sight. I look up at the 15-foot galvanized steel pole. The wooden box at the top is weathered now, the cedar turning a beautiful natural gray. Right on cue, the first tiny, winged silhouette drops out of the slats, catching the evening air and swooping gracefully over the lawn. Then another, and another. A steady stream of federally protected mosquito-eating machines going to work for me completely free of charge. Justice is sweet. But malicious compliance powered by the Federal Endangered Species Act? That's legendary.